This video is about tense, voice, and mood. It corresponds to section 7.7 of the Applied Analog Electronics textbook. Tense is about when things happened. Past tense for things in the past, future tense for things in the future, present tense for things going on now. There are a lot more tenses than just simple past, present, and future, and you use quite a few of them in writing. But there's some basic rules of thumb that you can use to make your writing seem more professional. Let's go over a couple of those basic rules. One is, if you have experimental results, those should be in the past tense. You already made these measurements, they're done. Don't talk about, oh, this is how it would be or how it has been. This is what it was. Simple, straightforward. But things that are continuously true, those should be in the present tense. So if you're saying that, well, the datasheet says that this part has 10 kiloohms at 25 degrees Celsius, well, that's true. It's always been true. It always will be true. That's what the datasheet says. So just say, that's what the datasheet says. Say, this part has this value. Don't try to put it in the past tense. Don't try to put it in the future tense. Don't try to be conditional about it. Just put it in the present. Okay, then there's discussion, remarks. When you're talking about what you're thinking about, generally this is in the present tense. It's what you're thinking now. It's not something that's always true necessarily, but it is not something that's done. And it's not something that's future. It's what's going on in your current thinking. Suggestions for actions. So, suggestions or plans. These will tend to be in the future tense. They're not things you've done yet, but they're things you might do in the future. And sometimes you can get discussions of results. And then sort of, well, is this a result? Does it go in the past tense? Is this a discussion? Does it go in the present tense? And that can be a little confusing. Quite often the way to think about that is things that really are results. That are, this is what I did, this is what I measured, this is the result I got. Those are past tense. This is what it means. That tends to be more present tense. So think about a little bit how much of it is this is the result, and how much of it is this is an interpretation of the result. This is discussion. And you can shift back and forth between present and past tense as long as you're making that sort of clear distinction between them. Don't switch between tenses arbitrarily. I've seen students shift in mid-sentence from future to past, and it just made no sense. I had to read the sentence repeatedly in order to figure out what they were really trying to say, and it was just that they'd lost control of, well, what tense am I talking in? So reread anything you've written, or more importantly, read anything your partner has written, because it's much easier to catch somebody else's problems than your own, and look for changes in tense. Where do you shift from past to present? Where do you shift from present to future, from present to past? And think about it. Are these changes in tense really intentional? Are they really shifting between going from a result to a plan? If not, think about putting things more uniformly in tense that's appropriate. Okay, that's probably enough on tense. It's not usually the biggest problem students have, other than people who've done no editing at all and have just turned in stream of consciousness where the tense shifts all over the place because they weren't paying attention to it. Bigger problem is overuse of passive voice. Avoid using passive voice. That doesn't mean never use it. There are times when it is quite appropriate to use passive voice. But there's a tendency for a lot of students to put everything into passive, to completely eliminate any active voice from their writing. And that makes for incredibly bad, hard to read writing that sounds awful. Unfortunately, some scientists teach this style of writing and use it in their own articles. And their articles are usually really hard to read. There's no reason for it. Passive voice has really two uses. And one of them is hiding the actor. Famous statements like, things were done, mistakes were made. Being very careful not to say who did what, or who made the mistakes. Hiding the actor is kind of the reason why a lot of scientists adopt the passive voice, trying to make it that these results are ones that anyone would have gotten doing these experiments. And the fact that we did these experiments is irrelevant. Unfortunately, it usually isn't. Almost all experiments, particularly in fields like biology, have a very strong batch effect, a very strong effect where in one person's lab things work, in another person's lab they don't work. And so who did things is often very, very important. Don't try to hide it. And you can say, we did these things, we got these results, and there's nothing wrong with that. So don't avoid including the actor. The actor can matter. And it really sounds awkward to say the impedance was measured when what you meant is we measured the impedance. The other use, however, for passive voice is one that does have an important role in any form of writing, including technical reports and scientific writing. And that is inverting the sentence for better flow. This goes back to something we talked about in a previous video, which says that flow comes from putting old information, the stuff people already know about, before the new information in a sentence. Now, if in an active sentence the old information would have been the object, then it's buried deep inside the sentence and you want to move it to the front to make it be the first thing, the old information coming first. And there, passive is a very useful tool. You can invert the sentence to bring that old information out to the front. And then the new information comes after that. Very occasionally you may use passive to put new information at the end of a sentence that connects to the next sentence. But most often it's to bring the object out to the front, where the object is the old information. So I give an example in the book. Let's take a look at that example, where we have some fairly choppy writing. So something like A creates B, C modifies B, and then D controls C. And now if you put these three concepts in this order, it's a sensible order in terms of the notion of the concept, but the flow is going to be awkward because A creates B, and then C, a brand new thing, B, something I've introduced before, D, brand new thing, C, something I've introduced before. The flow is wrong. So this is one where we could put some stuff in passive, and we could say A creates B, which is modified by C, which is controlled by D. And notice that this structure, I've used also the which is to sort of introduce the passive there, because I don't, the old information here, I don't even have to repeat the information. I can just point back to it immediately with which. So A creates B, which is modified by C, point back again, which is controlled by D. And that gives me something that flows smoothly. All the connections are clear. And I had to use some passive to get that smooth flow. This is the sort of use for which passive is appropriate. So I don't want you to do what some teachers do, have students do and say, never use passive, because passive is a very useful tool. But use it sparingly. Use it only for producing this sort of controlled flow, or very, very rarely for hiding the actor. In design reports, you almost never want to hide the actor, because the whole design report is about what you did, and so you want to make sure that it's you doing it. If somebody else did it, you want to make very clear exactly who did that, because claiming somebody else's work as your own is plagiarism, and it's the thing that can get you thrown out of the university. And if you just use passive to hide who did something, you're implicitly saying kind of we did this, but not explicitly saying that. If it's somebody else, you're cheating. So don't use passive. Claim the work that's yours and cite and acknowledge the work that isn't yours. Passive hides who did it, and that's wrong, because we need to know who did the work. Okay, so that's probably enough on passive voice. What do I mean by mood? And here I'm not talking about emotions. I'm talking about a grammatical concept, and it's actually subjunctive. And the subjunctive is often introduced by a helper word, would, or sometimes could. And this is something that gets way overused by students. Some students seem to think that would be is just some sort of formal form of the past tense. It's not. Where subjunctive has many uses in writing, but in technical writing, there's basically only one that's common, and that is to introduce a contrary to fact. So if you said the sound would be picked up by the microphone, that doesn't mean that the sound was picked up by the microphone. It means, well, it would be picked up by the microphone, but it wasn't, because there was a disconnect, that the microphone was in a pot of epoxy. I don't know what it was. There was something wrong, and it would have been picked up if things had been right, but they weren't. So whenever I see something would be or would have been something, I'm always expecting to see, but here's why it wasn't. So it's nearly always, in technical writing, this contrary to fact. You're introducing something that wasn't true. And a lot of times that's not what students mean. And so it's really jarring for somebody to be making a positive statement in a grammatical form that in technical writing is used to introducing something that isn't true as an introduction to why it wasn't true. So be very careful. Look at every instance you have of would or could, and check to make sure that you didn't just mean that it was, or it can be. So this is one that's easy to fix. It's an attempt for students to try to be formal without understanding what they're saying. So be less formal. Try to be direct and clear in your writing. The point of technical writing is to get the information to the reader, and clarity is really important. Using simple tenses, avoiding inflating your language by picking big words and big phrases that you don't really understand, it'll make it easier for your reader. You'll be clearer, and your reader will thank you. So, use would only for the contrary to fact. Now, that's not true of all forms of writing. There are many, many other uses for subjunctive in other forms of writing. But in technical writing, contrary to fact is about all we use the would be or would have been for. Okay, that's probably enough on tense, on passive voice, on subjunctive mood. Be sparing in your use of passive. Check almost every use of subjunctive, because 95% of the time you're probably misusing it. Okay, that's it for now.